Welcome, welcome. My name is Kristen Sorek West, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Executive Education here at the Yale School of Management. We are thrilled to have you here with us. Today we are celebrating Dr. Emma Seppälä and the launch of her new book, Sovereign: Reclaim Your Freedom, Energy, and Power in a Time of Distraction, Uncertainty, and Chaos. Before we kick things off, I have a few housekeeping items. We are expecting this webinar to last about 45 minutes. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be distributed afterwards to all registrants. We will also share this recording on social media. We encourage you to send us questions and comments throughout the webinar using the chat and Q&A features. Zoe and I will be moderating the chat, and we have time reserved at the end to answer your questions. You may have noticed when registering for the webinar that we are going to give away a signed early release copy of Emma's book to 3 lucky webinar attendees, and I will announce the winners at the very end of the webinar. You're likely here because you know Emma. You've heard her speak, you've received her warmth and her wisdom, and walked away armed with insights and energy. And if you don't know Emma, then, well, you're really in for a treat, because this conversation between Emma and Zoe is, I know, going to be fantastic. Emma is, among other things, the faculty director of our Women's Leadership Program and often speaks in our other executive education programs. We are pleased to make this conversation available to our SOM community members, including executive education program participants and our degree program alumni. Speaking with Emma today is Dr. Zoe Chance. Zoe is a faculty member at the Yale School of Management, specializing in persuasion and decision-making. Her book, Influence is Your Superpower, is an international bestseller and is published in 28 languages. Welcome, Emma. Welcome, Zoe. Zoe, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. And Emma, especially thank you to you for inviting me to get to be this person facilitating a conversation with you about your book that I absolutely, absolutely, absolutely love and am honored to share. By the way, everyone, please channel your multitasking energy, which you can't help having, into our session instead of out of our session, and use the chat. So you can ask questions, answer each other's questions, make comments, react, talk smack, pass notes, whatever it is that you want to do. Let's be here all together. I know many of you are some of you will be very familiar with Emma and know her really well, and some of you are somewhat familiar with Emma. A lot of us have read her book. Some of you have taken her class. And I just want to give you a few details about Emma so that you can really internalize what a badass this woman is. Emma is, in addition to being a best-selling author and a Yale teacher, is an international keynote speaker. She is, as you know, faculty director of the Women's Leadership Program at Yale. And I'm not supposed to say this probably in public, but that is my absolute favorite program that we have in exec ed. So it's not a coincidence that Emma is directing it. She's a psychologist and research by training. Her expertise is in the science of happiness, emotional intelligence, and social connection. Her best-selling book, The Happiness Track, which is also amazing, and you have to read it after you read Sovereign if you haven't already, has been translated into dozens of languages. And her new book, Sovereign, is coming out on April 23rd. She's also the science director of Stanford University's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And that's how Emma and I crossed paths now over a decade ago. So I've been a fan of her work for that long. Her research has been published in top academic journals and featured in major news outlets like New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, CBS News. She speaks and consults internationally for Fortune 500 companies like Google and Facebook. So hello, she could be doing that for yours. She contributes to Harvard Business Review, The Washington Post, Psychology Today, and Time, among others. She is really an international global thought leader in these areas. She's a repeat guest on Good Morning America. She has spoken multiple times at TEDx, so check those out too. Her research on breathing for military veterans with trauma was highlighted in the documentary Free the Mind, and this is fascinating, deep, soulful really nerdy, interesting work that you will love. She's been featured in other documentaries, including the Altruism Revolution, What You Do Matters, and Bullied. She's the recipient of a number of research grants and service awards, including the James Lyons Award from Stanford for founding Stanford's first academic class on the psychology of happiness and initiating other well-being programs for Stanford students. Some of this she was doing as a Stanford PhD student herself, and this is just what kind of person she is, that the world that she wants to live in is the world that she creates. She graduated from Yale with her BA, Columbia with her MA, Stanford with her PhD. She's originally from Paris, native speaker of French, English, and German, conversant in Spanish and Mandarin Chinese. She has lived in China as well. She's just the coolest. So let's hear from Emma. Hello. And Emma, can you tell us, to start with, what was it? So you wrote this amazing book, The Happiness Track, that so many of us have loved. And then what was it that had you needing or wanting to decide to write this book on sovereignty and to really create this whole space and the whole idea of becoming sovereign in this personal way?
Thank you so much, Zoe. So, having looked at the science of happiness and also applying some of the principles to my own life, I felt that it was really beneficial, but there was something else missing. And when I looked around, I just started to realize that, we could do all of the things that we know bring greater well-being, bring greater success. But if we're falling for beliefs or habits or behaviors or addictions that are destructive to us, then it doesn't matter what you're doing. And as I started to think about this more, I realized, wow, most of us do this, and in many different ways. And I thought that still keeps you in a bound state. You can meditate all day, but if you're falling for the belief that you're not good enough, for example, then it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe you'll be a little calmer, but you're not going to be able to show up as you're at your fullest potential, at your fullest strength. And that's what I call the bound state. And I saw how many people, including many of the participants in our programs, were showing up so talented, so much potential, and yet um, succumbing to beliefs that were standing in their own way. And so I thought, let's bring this to light, and let's have a roadmap to become aware of what is going on, and then deprogram. I like that word, deprogram ourselves around them. So
I really saw myself in that bound state that you described in the book, and I was surprised, actually, because I think of myself as generally being someone who has like fairly mentally healthy, fairly happy, so many things to be grateful for. And then I just recognize myself again and again and again, even in these sections where you describe things like your inner terrorist and you write about self-loathing, and I'm going, oh my God, I have that and I am that person. And am I doing a lot of emotional suppression? And am I actually bound while I'm imagining that I'm free? Um, I also hadn't separated the behaviors of pursuing happiness and mental health from that inner mindset, probably because I haven't been pursuing meditation like you have for decades.
yeah, that's so
When
fascinating, Zoe. I'd love to know like an example of what you what you recognized.
Oh God, like you described, for example, this situation that's my nightmare and that I have also basically experienced, where you missed a keynote. So you and I both do a lot of talks, and the worst thing that you could possibly do is to forget that you had one and not show up. I've had recurring nightmares about this for many, many years. And then it happened to me. And you described it happening to you, and then how you handled it with grace with yourself and with the people who are organizing the conference, and how you process that. And I thought, like, oh my God, I've done that once. It was about 5 years ago, and I'm still carrying so much shame and trauma from sucking on that one day and letting those people down. That's just one
That
example.
was intense.
Yeah. But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
do you want me to
so
describe?
since I brought it up,
Yeah.
can you just tell us a little bit about that? Because we all have situations where we've just royally messed up, and then some of us continue to carry it, and some of us manage to get past it.
Yeah, so absolutely. It's interesting because one of the early readers of my book said, "Why did you put this story? Nobody's ever going to hire you for a keynote again." But yeah, the book is full of stories that are real and authentic because we're all just real and authentic, and I'm not pretending anything. But yeah, so going back to that idea of the inner terrorist, so whenever I've asked audiences in executive education or otherwise, how many of you are self-critical, 90 to 95% of people raise their hand. And if you look at it from a psychological perspective, self-criticism is self-loathing, which is such a strong word. And yet, if you think about it, self-criticism is sort of, what was the last thing you said to yourself when you were when you messed up, and maybe we can use the chat here if you want to just remember the last time you did something embarrassing or made a big mistake and what words you used, what you said to yourself in that moment. So take a second to do that in the chat, because it's really informative to yourself and also to the point that I'm trying to make. Oh, wow, there's some coming in already. Yeah, and so if you look at these, if you read through them, it's really heartbreaking to see how people speak to themselves. And then if I ask the same question, like, what would you say to your best friend who made the same mistake? What are some words you would use? You would probably use something much more compassionate, much kinder. And so that's just one aspect of why do we have this different relationship with ourselves than with our best friend? What's the difference between the two? There's only one difference, and that's we live in different bodies. Like, that's pretty much the only difference. And yet, so that's one of these forms of social conditioning, you could call it whatever you want to call it, that we carry within us. And that is, we know from the research, very destructive to our mental health, our physical health. It's destructive to our sleep, it's destructive to our cognitive abilities. We have greater fear of failure, less likelihood to want to get up and try again, which is resilience, which we all want to be, is resilient. And that's something that can be so subtle, right? Just being hard on yourself. It's so subtle. Nobody needs to see it. And yet almost everybody's doing it. And you could pass it down in families. Like, I know that, when I was after my second baby, I was in a really hard postpartum period. And I said something, I can't remember what the words were exactly. Like, I don't think I could do this, about parenting. I don't think, something I said like that. And my eldest son, who was 3, heard me. And the next time he messed up, I heard him say those words. I'm like, wow, this is how we pass on this destructive programming that has no business being here. And it's so subtle that we're all in it. It's like the proverbial fish that's in water. And that's like, what's water? Because we're all in it. And so this book is an invitation to take a good look and question this destructive conditioning that we have in our mind. So that's just one example. And then you were talking about the emotion aspect of it. And one way that we bind ourselves with regard to the emotions is that most of us, when I ask audiences, like, what do you do with your big, bad, negative emotions? Usually the answer is suppression. Like, we're used to just suppressing our emotions because that's what we learned from all of society, from our parents. Most people, I always joke that no matter how many PhDs, MDs, black belts you have, languages you know how to speak, chances are you have as much education about what to do with your emotions as a 5-year-old. Which means no formal education, right? And so we've learned to suppress, and research shows that when you suppress, you're stronger at the level of and that's why it's more likely to come out as, somatically with, migraine, stomach aches, or explosions that are very sort of inappropriate, or passive aggression, or other things that are destructive to ourselves and our relationships. And a more sovereign approach to another thing, how do I compensate? How do I make myself feel better? And that's where all the addictions come in. And you might think, well, I'm not an addict, I'm not an alcoholic or whatever, but are you addicted to work? Are you addicted to doom scrolling? Are you addicted to entertainment? What do you do when you're feeling bad? Most people, when they're feeling bad, reach for something. And at the end of their engagement with whatever that is, they feel worse. And we haven't learned how to process our emotions. But a 5-year-old, and they feel their anger completely, and then it's over in like a minute and a half. What happened? Their best friends are the person they were just so angry with. Because emotion is energy in motion, and we haven't learned that we have to let it go through us and experience it to be free from it. And so adults can be angry for the rest of their lives. And it's something hard and painful to do, to feel your emotions. This is really painful. And I'm not saying we should have tantrums on the floor in the grocery store, but letting ourselves feel the pain. And so going back to this example, that day I was out in a park with my kids an hour from home, and I get a text, "Are you having trouble logging on?" And this was a keynote we had spent 6 months planning, and I was letting them down, and I was the opening keynote. And, it was devastating to do that to them. And my husband was sick that morning, and I was like, let me just take the kids to this park. And anyway, we were there, and the kids are throwing stones in the water. And I get this text message, and I realize I'm not going to make it because this is when I'm supposed to give my talk. And I remember feeling shame through and through, every cell of my body, just shame. That experience is so icky. And yet I wasn't going to take it further. Like, I wasn't also going to beat myself up, because first of all, I know the research, and I know I'm not going there. And isn't this punishment enough? But as I let myself just completely experience that emotion, and I experienced it for several hours, and then I went home and videotaped a keynote and sent it to them and told them to cancel my honorarium and all the things. But, and then I moved on, and it's the only way through is, it's only through that you got to feel it to heal it. And that's something that in our society, especially, we don't want to feel bad ever, but then we get stuck in these cycles, the emotions last, and then we get stuck in these sort of addictive behaviors that are not serving us. So that's just one example. Sovereignty is, and then there are different ways to make it easier, right? To go through these emotional, and I talk about that, but yeah, in summary.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and just describing that actually freeing yourself from that inner terrorism that comes up in a situation where we've messed up and we feel shame and guilt and all of that, that it didn't have to be complicated. That process you described is being present and experiencing the emotions. It's not complicated. It's just doing exactly the opposite of what you've been training yourself to do and going against those habits. And this is one of many examples in the book where I felt like this is just such deep wisdom, and I want to go back to it again to help me hopefully start to put these things into practice a bit. There was this one chapter in particular that I felt like, wow, I have to read this again, and maybe I have to read it again in like a decade, because it was really interesting, and I felt like I'm not intellectually or spiritually or just wisdom wise prepared for it yet. And this was the chapter on intuition. And I love that you wrote it. I am really interested in self-help, and I read lots of pop psychology books. I'm also a researcher, super interested in research. These things hardly overlap, and this is one of the ways that your book stands out so much from books in the self-help category. And I got to this chapter on intuition, and I was like, oh my God, Emma's a Yale professor, and she's writing about intuition. And how is this even possible? And I think I wasn't like, I guess, like I said, like, I'm not ready to hear it, but I want to understand it. Can you tell us a bit about intuition and where this fits in the wisdom path?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's more and more research happening on this, and 85% of CEOs report using intuition to make their decisions. So
Yeah, it's not just
something
women's
that's
intuition.
being used, and it's a gut feeling that we yeah, no. And, we all have, I think we've all had gut feelings that we've either followed or not followed, and then later been like, yeah, I kind of knew I shouldn't do that. I think we all have had that experience. Like, yeah, I knew, which is no big deal if it's, taken an order that you would rather not have taken. But it's a whole different thing if it's yes to a marriage or yes to a job or yes to a house. And then you're like, yeah, in hindsight, I kind of knew I shouldn't have done that, but it was like a major life thing it turned out into, right? But anyway, so I was really interested in this because I have met a number of leaders, including Lynn Tilton, who's an alumni of Yale SOM, was amazing. And I'll tell her story, and then I'll go into some of the science. But so Lynn, who is an absolutely incredible person, and everyone in the Women's Leadership Program who's an alum here will remember me talking about her. She had this she was a Yale undergraduate, and by the time she graduated, she was a single mom in the 80s and with no money. And she went to Wall Street to work in banking in order to support her child. And she got sexually harassed every single day, both by colleagues and clients. And after about 10 years or so, she kind of was like, okay, I'm out of here. She's like, I'm retiring. I'm out of here. I'm going to Florida. That's it. Bye, guys. I'm out. And she got to Florida. And then she had an intuition that came to her in the form of sort of a dream, where her father came to her, deceased father. Now, her father had deceased when she was a teenager, and she had firsthand witnessed what it's like when the primary provider of a family passes away, and the huge challenge that is, because she'd gotten into Yale on a tennis grant. Anyway, so here she was in Florida, and her father, she feels her father telling her, this is not what I had in mind for you, for her to just like retire, right? And so she decided, wow, okay, I gotta do something. And she decided that she was gonna devote her life to making sure other families don't lose their primary provider. And so she went and decided to buy companies that everyone had given up on, including all the consulting companies had given up on, and to buy these companies and turn them around. And she's been dubbed the turnaround queen because she's done that for so many companies. At one point, she had 700,000 employees under her and was CEO of multiple companies. She's absolutely amazing, and she has saved so many jobs and families because she followed this absolutely crazy gut feeling, absolutely crazy thing that nobody else was doing, because they were all like, these companies forget about it, right? Including like Style and Makeup and companies that we've all heard of that did really well. So going back to the science of this, so my former grad school colleague Joe Michaels has looked at the neuroscience of decision making, and whether we should go with our gut feeling or think logically through it. Now, of course, logic and reason are fantastic tools, right? Obviously, but we also have these gut feelings. And what he found is that if the decision is simple, and let's say your computer's broken and maybe you should buy a new computer, right? It's no big deal. Like you're going to make a good decision just using your rational mind. But if it's a complicated decision, like I just got a job in this other city, now I'd have to move and we'd have to change schools and we have to buy a new house. We have like a lot of complex things happening. Then going with your gut feeling is going to lead to a better decision-making process. That's what he's found in his neuroimaging research, just really fascinating stuff. And the military has been doing research on intuition for decades. And it was made fun of actually in a movie called Men Who Stare at Goats. But then there is still research happening right now because of all of the soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq reporting how they had, decided not to go down that road, even though they were supposed to go down that road, but they've had a feeling they shouldn't go down that road, and they saved their lives and the lives of the people with them. And there were so many reports of that. And I talked to a military scientist about this, and he was saying that they kept finding that the choices they were making were better than chance, and that it's something that because the military is always trying to improve human performance, trying to figure out and research this more. So it is, I think, just like when I was in grad school about 15, 20 years ago, and I was doing research on things like meditation, people were telling me, oh, you don't want to be classified as a meditation teacher. That's, that's kind of, that's not mainstream or whatever. And now like every other person's doing research on meditation. It's a very, very big topic. I predict that's going to be the same for intuition, because I've seen also for my book, I was researching some programs that they're doing in India with children. And I've seen how they're training blind kids who can't see how to maneuver their lives in a way as if they had sight. I mean, they're helping them develop really strong skills. I guess with kids, it's much easier to start that in an early process. But there are so many cognitive abilities we haven't yet explored yet. We know that we don't know much about the brain. And there are many faculties that are there, and animals have an instinct. How do animals know there's a big storm coming, an earthquake coming? We don't know. It's just you could think of it as an instinct, or when we think of it that way, it doesn't seem quite so foreign.
Can I ask you about it? I found this whole topic so fascinating, and I was also reminded of this book that maybe some people on the call will have read, called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. He's a personal security expert. He's maybe the leading personal security expert in the world. And he wrote about how every single person he has interviewed or worked with who has experienced an episode of personal violence had a funny feeling, an intuition that they had ignored.
Mhm.
And when I've talked about that with students sometimes in the class that I teach, what comes up is that we also get funny feelings that come from social biases, right? Like if, you're from a different race or a different culture, if you're a man versus a woman, or all of these things that might have us be prejudiced against each other, those can give us funny feelings too, right?
Right.
How do we know when
You
to
have to
go with our intuition or when it's some fear that we should actually not follow up on?
absolutely. And it's very important to distinguish between those two things. And, that's why one of the things that I emphasize a lot in the book, and also because there's so much research on it, is just the importance of taking time to either meditate or find other ways to settle your mind so you can also become more self-aware. Because absolutely, fear can be misinterpreted as intuition when it's your fear. It's not what's going on out there. It's your bias, or it's your, or your state of mind. Like maybe you haven't slept and you're hungry and you're stressed, and then, you're going to jump into conclusions when you really don't need to. And that's a really important point and to keep in mind. Um, and going back to this gift of fear thing, and actually a lot of the military members that I interviewed for the book talked to me about that book in particular as well. So this is some research that our lab at Stanford with James Gross, the professor of the lab, conducted, was on this idea of the funny feeling. And this goes back to the point about suppression. So if I were to suppress anger right now, and talk to you and be like, I'm not angry, and you wouldn't, from my face, be able to recognize that I'm angry, but your heart rate would go up, and you wouldn't know why, but you would maybe feel a funny feeling. You see that?
Mm.
And we see that in animal models too. So if therapists are using horses, equine facilitate therapy, if the patient comes up and is scared of the horse and is like, I'm not scared, no, nothing, I'm totally cool here, but they're scared, the horse gets anxious, is moving all over the place. The horse, of course, doesn't understand the human language, but what the horse is registering instinctually, physiologically, empathically right away is a lack of authenticity. And we register inauthenticity as threat. You see that? And as soon as the person says, okay, I'm scared, the horse calms down. No, and we have the same instinct. So if someone's suppressing anger, your heart rate goes up. Intellectually, you don't know why, but your body's got a funny feeling. You see that? Because of inauthenticity. So we have these physiologically empathic resonance that's happening all the time, and that can sometimes be an indicator. So probably in these instances where there was a funny feeling before an aggression, there was already a physiological resonance towards danger. It was an alarm bell going off internally. But yes, like you said, it's a delicate balance. And when I asked Joe Michaels, how do you use your intuition since you research it? And he says, well, I use my rational, logical mind, but I consult my intuition when making complex decisions in particular. So I think that's really wise. And Lynn says the same thing. Lynn says, she says, and intuition is, gives you the impulse, but then you use your mind and your logic and to work through it, whatever it is that you're going to do. And that's what she's done so beautifully.
Thank you. We want to give people who are attending the call a chance. Let me use this as a cue. Those of you who are listening to the conversation, think about what kinds of questions you might want to ask Emma. And I just want to ask you one more question myself. And also I'll give everyone an opportunity to know where to find this book. I was wondering, as I was reading this book and as we've talked about it, about what aspects of sovereignty might have gendered recommendations, but maybe that's just too specific. So you run the women's leadership program, and men, thank you for being on the call. This is clearly a book that resonates with me as a woman, but it didn't seem like this is a book that you've written just for women,
Right.
right? Where do you see gender in the discussion of sovereignty that you want to be sparking?
I think, I mean, it's not really gendered in the sense that we are all born sovereign. It's our birthright. I really feel that. And so for me, I built sort of an equation around what sovereignty is. It's awareness plus courage plus a full tank. Like, it's good to have all those three going on if you want to be. And someone with John just asked, can we sharpen intuition? I mean, a lot of it has to do with awareness, but not just awareness to the outside world, but also internally. And that can be, there are many tools I discuss in the book, one of which is meditation, in the sense that when you do meditation, you both increase your self-awareness, but you also increase your self-regulation, emotion regulation, and your ability to attend both internally and externally, and to be present, because we live in a time when, when are people actually present? There's over 60,000 gigabytes of information that we take in every day. It's a surprise that we can have any kind of conversation, honestly. And we lose our sovereignty in the programming of that space. I was actually talking to a social media influencer about his experience, since this is his profession, and his experience with the amount of information coming. And he said, I create, I don't consume, because otherwise you lose yourself in the programming of the social space. I mean, that's just one example within the social media, but how many of us have that degree of awareness? And yet it's, 70% of people on their deathbed regret not living the life they wanted. And I was just think, wow, how many of us are succumbing either to fears or to distractions or to ways of thinking or addictive behaviors that are getting in the way of us showing up the way we really want to show up for ourselves, for people around us, for our families, doing what we actually want to do. And there's actually one person who's here. I won't mention her name out of discretion, but she was a very big inspiration for the chapter on sovereign mind, because she, when I met her at the Women's Leadership Program, she was really thinking about some of the conditioning that she had received in her life and through society and through her experiences, her life experiences, and those of her ancestors, that it created a level of fear that was keeping her restricted in terms of how far she was letting herself go in life. And she felt like, I deserve more. I want more. I want to expand. I want to expand my leadership role. I want to expand what I'm doing. And she told me, and I interviewed her for the book, but she told me, you got to stare that belief in the face. You got to stare it down, because and not let it win. And now she went on to do incredible things with her career, and is still doing. She's continuing, and because she decided not to be restricted by that.
Thank you. And thank you for being an inspiration, nameless role model. For everyone here on the call, what you can hear from Emma is, first of all, her warmth and the engaging way in which she offers up food for thought and shares stories, and so much research that, like, we're nerdy, I think all of us, and you will find this extra persuasive. So she's engaging, she's persuasive, and it's very practical. So we had a question, how do we sharpen intuition? There are so many practical takeaways in this book. I'm going to put the link to the book in the chat right now. I'm putting the Amazon link here. You can also find it on Emma's website. But I will encourage you, if you would like to read Emma's book, like, also, why are you here if you don't want to read Emma's book, right? You already know that it's interesting. But I'm going to give you my own invitation and request about this, which is, please, if you're going to get this book and read it anyway, get it now and order it now and review it as soon as it comes out. It comes out on April 23rd. And it will make a world of difference to Emma and her publisher and everyone who has worked with her on this book. If you could review this book during the first day or two or week that it's out, it takes people a long time to review books because it takes people a long time to read books. But what happens is there's a cycle of momentum where books that get reviewed quickly then get recommended, and then they get more readers and more reviews. And so we can really help the success of Emma's book. So also, along with that, what I will say is, as my recommendation, Emma isn't endorsing this, is it's fine to review a book before you finished it. Like, please don't review a book before you start it. But as long as you have read enough of it to know that this really is a book that you can recommend, don't tell yourself that you have to have finished it before you review it. And it turns out a lot of people haven't. And a lot of people just haven't finished books that they have bought and loved and recommended. So, and already pre-ordered. Awesome. And Lay, hi Lay, great to see you, hear you. I appreciate Lay puts it better. The best way to support a mission-driven author is to pre-order her book. Thank you. Emma, let's look at some of these questions. And here you were already answering about how to develop intuition. And okay, they're great comments, so helpful here. By the way, multiple comments, feel it to heal it, really resonated. It resonated for me too, as well. And ooh, I don't know if you can explain this, but I think many of us might be curious about how would you explain chemistry? Is this an intuition? And is that a kind of intuition that we should trust?
That's a tough one. And I don't know that I can, scientifically speak to that. But I do talk in the chapter on relationships about, how often relationships are mirrors for our own patterns, for better or for worse, and can really help us become aware of some of the imprints in our mind, some of the beliefs that we have in our mind. And sometimes we do partner up with someone who's going to, where we have that sense, whether we call it intuition or physiological resonance, that they are going to be a good mirror for us, and I do believe that's more subconscious. But our relationships, whether they end up being good or bad, often end up teaching us a lot about ourselves if we're willing to take a good look at them. And I go into depth about that in the relationships chapter. Thank you for asking. That's a really, really good question.
Thank you. And the relationships chapter you mentioned, the intuition chapter is just one chapter. It's not that this is a woo-woo book focused largely on intuition at all. We have chapters on your emotions, your relationships, your body. This is a very holistic book on what I see in your teaching and writing about sovereignty is giving yourself the freedom to make choices and looking at the programming that you have and the habits that you've built. And we talked about self-criticism. And I love your writing on boundaries and how boundaries give you freedom. And you need to read the book to read this story. I think it's not just academics who will relate to this, but Emma has one of the greatest stories that I've read about drawing boundaries. And I read this and was like, oh my God, I can't imagine being courageous enough to draw boundaries in the way that you did. And it was successful. You just have to read it. I want to share a question that came in through Q&A. Self-doubt gets in the way of sovereignty. It's such an insidious programmed trait. How do we start to learn to trust ourselves?
Why shouldn't you trust yourself, first of all? And again, is that a program running in your head that you can't trust yourself? So many of the thoughts that are in your mind that are preventing you from showing up as you wish to they're not serving you, and they're binding you, and you didn't create them. Chances are you absorbed them from your environment, from your situations, from your childhood, or from your culture. And it doesn't matter where that came from. This is not a book about, analyzing your childhood. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's like, well, where am I at right now? Oh, wow, look at this. It's keeping me smaller than I want to be. And then noticing it as that, first of all, that awareness is a first step of like, wow, that's not me. That's just it's like a program that's running, and I'm going to deprogram that, or I'm not going to listen to that. And then becoming free from that, which requires some courageous steps. And yet when you take those, then that's not a problem anymore. And that's where the whole courage aspect comes in. And I do talk about that. For example, the whole, setting boundaries. There's certain things that are really scary. If you think about what's my biggest fear, right? But once you've overcome that, once you push yourself to do whatever it is you're afraid of, it has no more power over you. Gone. You're completely sovereign. So this is just one example. Whatever is keeping you feeling smaller than you want to be, keeping you in fear, and keeping you is what's keeping you bound, all of that, that's what I'm inviting you to dismantle, and you can do that. And just one quick word about trauma. For trauma is there for many people around certain things, and I do talk about that and addressing that, and that was where the research with veterans comes in, because sometimes what's keeping us held back is trauma, is fear, and yet that is also something that I invite you to heal. I've got some research that my colleagues and I ran, but there are other methods as well, and that definitely is important.
Thank you. Yeah, for the respecting some of what's holding you back, maybe legitimate trauma. And you're not trying to minimize that. But
No.
actually, there was a way of minimizing that I thought would be really helpful in situations that are more manageable that I'm going to put into practice, which was when you were writing about the self-loathing, self-criticism, self-doubt, and you suggested naming that voice. And I think I've heard like somebody mention something like that before, and I was like, okay. But then the name that you gave it, I could do that. You said, "Hey, boo." And I thought I was gonna name this thing like, I don't know, like Godzilla or something like that critical voice. And I thought like, oh, like, what if it's just boo? What if it's boo? Like, "Hey, boo. Yeah, yeah, I hear you. Not gonna follow your advice, but I got it. That's fine."
Yeah. I mean, and I often think also, around this, again, someone was asking, is this book all about just self-loathing? And it's not. That's just the first chapter, Greg. There's so much more.
So much.
I talk about our bound emotions and sovereign emotions. Oof, give me a little thumbs up. Around relationships, intuition, our relationship with the body, and so forth. But one thing I like to think about often is, the words that we use for ourselves, would we use those for our child? Or any child. If you don't have a child, would you? Never in our right mind would we do that. Never in our right mind. And if we just think about it that way, it's like, hey, you're only guaranteed one relationship your whole life that is going to be there always 24/7 for the rest of your life. And that's your relationship with you. What's it going to be like? It's going to be a good one.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. There's so much to talk about and so much to think about in this book. So you just have to read it. You're absolutely going to enjoy it. I also believe that books like yours, and yours especially, have the opportunity to change the whole approach of the self-help industry. And I've had a chip on my shoulder about self-help books accidentally, I think, hopefully not intentionally, making us feel bad about ourselves. Because in order to fix something, we start looking at what's wrong. And I feel like your book does exactly the opposite. And this is the kind of self-help books that I wish that more people would write. But because there are not enough of them, then it's extra special that we have yours. So
Aw.
Emma, thank you so, so much for writing this and sharing it. And Kristen, thank you for organizing everybody who's here. Thank you for showing up. And let me pass it over to you, Kristen.
And just thank you, Zoe, for your incredible graciousness and generosity. And everybody, I hope you have read Zoe's really cool book, which is right there on the shelf behind her and was awesome. Influence is your superpower. Thank you, my dear.
Thank you, Emma.
It's like a bright yellow shining star, right, hovering over your shoulder, Zoe. It's lovely.
Yes.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to share before we depart the 3 winners of the book raffle. That would be Beth Nagash, Anjali Shikar, and Willow Withley. So I will be emailing you directly for your mailing address and more details. So congratulations to those 3 winners.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Be sovereign, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Zoe. This was a wonderful time, a wonderful conversation, a wonderful introduction to Sovereign. I can't wait to read it myself. Thank you to our SOM community for showing up. Thank you for the support, for joining this call, for reading Sovereign, and for sharing it with your friends. We love sharing new ways to continue lifelong learning with you, especially when we get to highlight our fantastic faculty. So we really appreciate your support and your engagement on this call today. My contact information and resources to learn more about Emma and Sovereign, including this webinar recording, will be sent to you in a follow-up email. Please let us know if you have any questions. We're here to help. We're here to help you along the way. Cheers again to our book winners. Congratulations again to Emma on writing and releasing this book. It really, truly is an impressive accomplishment. So with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time today. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar. Goodbye.